Wallapalai Prabhakaran founded the Tamil Tigers in the mid-1970s. Back then, they were a small group of militants, but over time, they would become one of the most powerful guerrilla armies in the world. In July 1983, the Tamil Tigers ambushed and killed 13 government soldiers. Emotions were stirred in the south, and what followed would become a turning point in Sri Lanka's history. Gangs of Sinhalese thugs attacked Tamils and destroyed their property, and it's an open secret that certain politicians influenced the violence.
I certainly do believe the attacks were orchestrated and instigated by people in power at that time. There's no question about it. But I also think the bigger blame is that the government didn't move to stop it.
Chandragupta Amarasinghe was a photojournalist at the time, and despite a ban on the media, he managed to take a photograph of a young Tamil man moments before he was killed. The vast majority of ordinary Sinhalese had no involvement in the death and destruction, but the July violence is portrayed as race riots, and over the coming months, the support for the militants fighting in the north would increase significantly.
What happens in Sri Lanka happens in the rest of the world 25, 30 years later. I mean, we can teach Mr. Bush about terrorism. We can teach a lot of countries lessons that they are now seeking answers for.
The Tamil Tigers would take on the government of Sri Lanka, and in the bloody battles that followed, thousands of people would die. The conflict has been part of Sanjana Hathatua's whole life, and the political turmoil in Sri Lanka forced him to go to university in India. Sanjana describes himself as a peace builder and has his own TV program.
So as someone who was born in Sri Lanka, I think you feel for the country and the inability of the country to just get itself out of violence.
We miss a generation, no? One generation, one entire generation of political leaders who would have been creative and who would have been brave are dead.
The disappearances and killings of young men and women in the south of the country is another dark chapter in Sri Lanka's modern history. While the Tamil militants were becoming active in the north, a Marxist-based People's Liberation Movement called the JVP formed in the south. They advocated principles of socialism and equality and attracted thousands of young people, including Sunila, to their movement.
It was a very amazing moment for me. I mean, I was just an average middle-class girl going to a nice, very safe middle-class school, and I was really impressed. Because I read about politics. My father was a very political man. We had a lot of books in the house. He really strongly believed in socialism and so forth. But to see it actually happening in front of your eyes in your own country, that was amazing. And then, 71 happened, and it was very profoundly shocking.
The JVP Marxists tried to take over the government by force, but the young revolutionaries were disorganized, and the security forces crushed the movement. Thousands were killed, and tens of thousands were put into rehabilitation camps. Support groups were formed to monitor their human rights and assist their families.
I became a part of that process, and in that process, I got to know the JVPs, because first I helped their families, and then I got to know some of the young men. And by that time, I was just really crazily convinced that this was the way to go forward.
But after a few years, Sunila began to disagree with some of the policies the JVP were adopting.
My alienation from the JVP already took place in 1981. I was expelled.
The JVP became less interested in equality. The leadership had political ambitions and began to cater to the majority Sinhalese, knowing that their support was adequate to win power through the ballot.
We had questions about that, about revolutionary politics and, revolutionary politics of equality that were being then pushed onto the side by this analysis and by because the analysis would immediately translate it into programmatic action, And that's then, the downslide, according to me, to 1987 and the creation of the Patriotic People's Movement. And by that time, I was on their death list. So it's like a curious transition to make.
The JVP didn't get voted into power, and a few years later, they began a campaign that would cripple the country and terrorize the people. Their strategy was to kill anyone connected to the government and those who opposed their ideology. Many of Sunila's friends and colleagues were murdered by the JVP.
It was such like a weird reason. Why are they dead and why am I alive? And I thought, okay, you live for a reason. Then the reason is to constantly put that politics of anti-racism back on the agenda. Every time something happens and people try to, push it away, you say no. If these people were alive, they would have done it. And so you do it. You do it for yourself. Certainly I do it for myself. But I also do it for all those people who would have done it if they were alive.
When the JVP started attacking the families of the armed forces, the military struck back hard, wiping out most of its leadership. Security forces and vigilante groups went on a rampage, targeting anyone who was suspected of being a JVP sympathizer. In the crackdown, thousands of innocent young people were also killed.